Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another video with Swaggle. And in this video, we got ourselves a comic book unboxing to do on the channel here today for what is unquestionably the biggest grail to have ever come out of the copper age of comic books. So in this video, I'm going to do the unboxing, and it actually is a newsstand copy. And I want to talk a little bit more about newsstand comic books out there in the market, because I may have changed my opinion on the value of newsstand comic books as they're compared to their direct comic book counterparts. And I want to kind of dig into some of the data with you guys, look at some of the numbers of different newsstand comic books throughout sort of the years, and ask the question, are newsstands always more valuable than their direct comic counterparts, and is it justified for them to command that premium? But before I get into the video, if you guys could drop me a like, all right, so now we got to do the fun stuff. We got to undo this box. Always undoing boxes here today. This is a book that, I just happened to be on eBay. I was perusing, just some comics I was interested in, taking a look, seeing what was out there. And I, from time to time, look at this particular book on eBay. And I happened to notice that there was a particular version of this book, a newsstand version, that was priced at a certain price that I felt like, I felt disrespected. I felt like the floor price for this book was way too low for what the person had it at, and I felt like I had to buy it now. We got to sweep the floor. We can't have books like this being valued at that price range, so I had to make sure that it didn't go any lower, and I decided to pick this one up because actually this was a really good value buy. In fact, when I was looking over some of the data of this particular book, this is the third lowest price anyone has ever paid for at least the newsstand version of this book right here. And the book I am talking about is the biggest grail to have ever come out of the Silver Age. Well, we're talking about, of course, Darkhawk #1 newsstand edition in a 9.6 grade with white pages. Obviously, the greatest book to have ever been made in the history of comic books. And I decided that it would be worth picking this one up because the list price for this as a buy it now was $70. I couldn't believe it. When I saw this book being sold at $70, I was like, that's ridiculous. For a newsstand copy, I'm swooping that up immediately. And you never really know. I might decide to crack this one out and see if it had a 9.8 potential because, I was looking at it. I couldn't really see it close up. Does it have? No. Okay. All right. I can actually see one or two spine ticks. I see that this, in fact, probably is a 9.6 candidate. But regardless, it still was worth picking up. Probably not worth the resubmission. But, newsstand copy, I think is totally worth it when we're talking about, this particular year, which this particular year of comic book when it came out was 1991. And, I think it is pretty, a consensus amongst comic book collectors that newsstand comic books that come out after, say, 1987 or 88 or so are, in fact, more rare than newsstands prior to that when most comic books were being sold at newsstands. And so I kind of wanted to look at some of the, numbers with you guys and look at some of the, recent sales and see if we can make any conclusions about newsstand copies anyways, because there's actually been a lot of discussion in the market about newsstand copies, whether they in fact are more rare, whether in fact they, are worth paying that premium. A lot of people always mention that pre-1987 newsstands were in fact more highly printed than that of the direct comic counterparts. But also people make the argument that, in general, anecdotally, the newsstand copies were handled more poorly. People pulling them off the newsstands, actually reading them, versus the direct editions were probably, going to comic book stores and immediately bagged and boarded. And so therefore, all the newsstands, even though there are more of them, the ones that are in those 9.8 conditions are actually a lot more rare. And it's kind of been one of those things where it's like there's no way to really prove that because, CGC doesn't actually take census for newsstands versus directs, at least, not for every single comic book out there. So there's no real way for us to tell if that's actually true. It's just something that people kind of, talk about anecdotally. But, we can look at some of the sales data and compare some of the censuses and look at it empirically just to see if that is actually true. So let's kind of dig into, some of the comparisons here. I pulled up a few few books that kind of go through the different eras. And I thought that these would be good books to look at because they're, all key books with direct and newsstand counterparts. And I think that they, can paint a good picture for us if it is actually the case that newsstands not only command a premium, but are actually worth the premium because, in fact, they are more rare. So here we have Moon Knight #1. Of course, you guys know this book. Moon Knight #1, first issue of the ongoing series, first appearance of Khonshu and Bushman and the origin of Moon Knight. This is a book that came out in 1980. And let's quickly look at the census here. Now this says 9.8s have 1,109 on the census. Usually CGC doesn't differentiate between newsstands and directs in terms of the census, so that is a shared number. But let's take a look at some of the values here and at least determine what the market is asking for this book. So at the 9.8 level, here the 30-day moving is $405. The 90-day moving was $574. All right, 405 and 574. Let's remember those numbers and let's hop over to Moon Knight #1 newsstand edition. Now you'll see here universal copies. It doesn't actually have it broken out, but we do actually have the sales data for newsstand versus direct. And if we look here at the 9.8s, let's take a look at some of the 30-day and 90-day moving averages. 90-day moving here is 413 and 30-day moving is 442. So if we're looking at this book 1980 in terms of its direct versus newsstand editions, generally speaking, let's look at the 30-day first. 405 versus 442. You could say that the newsstand is a little bit more expensive, but 442 to 405 is basically the same number. 90-day moving 413 versus actually the direct is 574. Let's take a look at the 1 year with 773, and then the 1 year for the newsstand is 703. So, generally speaking, when we're looking at Moon Knight 1, a book that came out in 1980, it seems like price-wise, it doesn't really matter. It seems like the market doesn't necessarily favor newsstands in terms of value more than that of their direct edition counterparts. But if we dig into kind of, the breakdown of the sales, this is where I think it gets kind of interesting because, if you'll notice, Go Collect actually does kind of point out, how many sales for the newsstands actually occurred. So let's actually count how many there were. So there was 1 here in October. There were 2 here in September. There were 2 in August, 1 in July, 1 in June, 1 in May, 2 in April. I don't even need to go to, the next pages just because I kind of wanted to just show you guys that generally speaking, it seems like the newsstand version of this book, at least at the 9.8 level, sells maybe once or twice a month consistently. So let's take a look at the direct edition and see how many sales there actually are for this book. Well, if we look at it here, just on this page alone, we see 1, 2, 3 books for the direct edition that sold in November here. We see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 books that sold in October. And then we see 1, 2, we're going to have to go to the next page, 3, 4, 5 books that sold in September. Actually make that 6, 7, 8 books that sold in September. And then in August, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we have to go to the next page, 5, 6, 7 books that sold in August. So I don't need to really count anymore. But generally speaking, what that kind of shows me is that even though the market doesn't necessarily put a premium value on the newsstand copies, it does seem to be the case that the newsstands in 9.8 are in fact more rare, or at least it seems like there doesn't seem to be as many sales for them. Now, there could be some caveats to this. Maybe people don't like to sell their newsstand copies because they're holding on to it. Maybe the people out there who have newsstand copies mark them up really high because they think that they should be more valuable. Therefore, there aren't as many sales, people pulling the trigger because they don't want to pay that newsstand premium. But generally speaking, what we do see there is that the newsstands are in fact, quote unquote, less often to be sold and or bought at that 9.8 level, but the market doesn't necessarily command a premium. Well, let's kind of hop to another example here and take a look at this. And I think that this will be really interesting too, because this is also a book that came out in 1980 and has a direct versus newsstand counterpart. Here we're looking at Savage She-Hulk #1. Of course, you guys know this book. First appearance of Jennifer Walters, aka She-Hulk. Of course, this was a book that got really hot during She-Hulk all throughout this last year, and then definitely kind of fell off the cliff after the show. But let's take a look at some of the census here for this book. 9.8s have 2,500 on the census, and the 30-day moving for the direct edition is 503. 90-day moving is 632. But let's hop over to the newsstand and see if that is actually the same. So 9.8's 30-day moving is 672, and 90-day moving is 686. So what did we say the numbers were here? If we go back, 503 30-day moving and 9-day moving is 632. So on the 30-day moving, we can see that maybe we can make this argument that, the newsstand commands a little bit of a premium, even though this is of a year where it shouldn't really matter in terms of the volume of the census of how many are out there. But let's take a look and see how many sales happen each and every month for this book. So if we're looking at the direct edition here and I go down to November, how many are in this month of November? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I got to go to the next page here. Let's take a look at that. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. 19 direct CGC 9.8s sold in the month of November alone. Let's take a look at the newsstands and see how many sales happen in the month of November. Well, we see 1 and 2. So 1 and 2, similarly in October, 1, 2, 3, and then in September, 1, 2, 3, and then August, 1, 2. So to me, this is where I kind of think it is pretty interesting that even in this year of 1980, when newsstands are supposed to be much more of the census out there in the market, people have often said, well, the newsstands weren't taken as well care of, therefore there's actually less 9.8s out there. And even if the market doesn't actually value the newsstand copies as much, it does in fact seem like there are less being bought and sold. So ipso facto, it does feel like the census for the newsstand 9.8s are in fact a lot more rare. Now let's kind of jump forward here, and I just want to show you guys a couple more quick examples to see, when the corner starts to turn for the values of books in what specific years. Here in 1983, we have Beta Ray Bill, first appearance of the character in Thor 337. Let's take a look at the 9.8s, 1,357 on the census. 30-day moving doesn't have a 30-day moving, but 90-day moving is 628. Well, let's hop over to the newsstand and see what this one commands. Here are the 9.8s, 90-day moving is 802. The 30-day moving is kind of right in line to that at 800. So, if we're comparing at least the 90-day moving of 628 to, the newsstand 90-day moving of 802, it does in fact seem like the newsstand for this 1983 book is commanding a slight premium over that of the direct edition. But let's also take a look at how many are actually being sold in a given month. So if we start with the newsstand ones here, we can count 1, 2, 3, in the month of November. We see 1 in October, and we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in September right there. So let's hop over to the direct and see how many are being sold in the respective months. We see 0 in November. We see 1 in October. We see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in September right there. So pretty interesting that actually in this particular book's case, it does in fact seem like, at least, anecdotally speaking, the sales are actually pretty consistent between the newsstands and the directs, yet the market still values the newsstands more. At least it does in fact hold a bigger premium for those particular books. So that is very interesting to see that. Let me know what you guys think about that particular example and that particular takeaway. Now let's hop over to 1986 here, where we see X Factor number 6, first appearance of Apocalypse. This is where I start to see the gap really starting to widen for the values of this book, where at the 9.8 level, we see the 30-day moving for this book is $400. If we hop over to the newsstand edition, at the 9.8 level, there is no 30-day moving, but the 90-day is $800. So, definitely a premium on this book, when we're comparing it, at least at the that particular level, where the 90-day moving for the direct was actually $450. So if we count how many are for sale in any given month, well, there were none in November, there were none in October, there was 1 in September, there was 1 in August, and then there were 3 back in June. And if we go to the direct edition for this Apocalypse book right here, we can see that there are 2 in November, there are 5 in October, and then there are at least 3 on this first page in September. So we can see that is much more consistent in terms of like how many times this book goes up for sale at the direct edition counterpart, which is, a reason why the newsstand does in fact command more of a premium, because it is either possibly or likely more rare, or again, people could just be asking for that premium price, and therefore it is less likely that someone is going to buy it, although it does seem like, the value of it holds a little bit more than that of the direct. Then once we get to 1987 here with Mr. Sinister, we see that the 30-day moving for the 9.8 at this book is $333. If we hop over to the newsstand, we can see that the 30-day moving is, there hasn't been a sale, but the 90-day moving is $1150. And if we go back, what was the 90-day moving for this book? $3 382. So this book is, in 1987 is really starting to pull ahead in terms of what the newsstand is commanding as opposed to the direct counterpart. We all know about ASM 300 the next year, 1988. 9.8s currently are selling around the $4,000 range. ASM 300 newsstand doesn't actually sell that often, but there was a sale that happened earlier this year at $18,600, which is a lot more than what the direct edition sells for. Then, of course, 1990 with X-Men 266, first appearance of Gambit, if we want to call it that. The 9.8's 30-day moving 802. The 9.8 newsstand edition for this sells around that $2,000 price point. And then, of course, we get to ASM 361, similar graph where the 9.8 sells for $485, but the newsstand here in 1992 actually sells for $629, which isn't quite the spread that we saw with some of the other books, but that could just be a point for you guys to maybe look out for those ASM 361 newsstands. So that's kind of me just kind of breaking it down, looking over the newsstand copies. It does seem like the market, no matter what year, even if there's no reason for this, does in fact put a little bit of a premium on the newsstand copies. And if we're just kind of digging into, counting how many times these things get sold, it does appear that generally speaking, the newsstands are more rare in terms of how often they were bought and sold. Now, again, there could be a lot of different factors to this. There could be reasons that, people just think the newsstands are more rare. Therefore, they always ask a higher premium on those prices, and collectors just don't feel like paying those prices. Therefore, they don't sell as often. That's maybe a possibility, but you would think that eventually if, dealers want to, move their inventory, that would create that downward pressure, and you would see more sales of newsstand copies, for like Savage She-Hulk #1, and that would be equaling the value of the direct edition. So it's really interesting to think about. Let me know what you guys think. Of course, we're only talking about newsstands in terms of, say, sort of resale value and evaluating the market. I've always personally never really cared about, newsstand copies, from a, collecting standpoint. In fact, I'd actually rather see Spider-Man or Captain America down there in the bottom as opposed to this ugly barcode. But I felt like, as a serious Darkhawk collector, I had to get a newsstand edition, especially since it was being sold at $70, which was an absolute steal if you ask me. And ultimately, that is why I decided to make this purchase. Anyways, that's all for this video. That was me showing off my Darkhawk #1 9.6 newsstand. What is the difference between a 9.6 and 9.8? To me, they're the same thing. Let me know what you guys think. What do you guys think about newsstand copies versus direct editions? How do you guys feel about them? Drop me a like, comment, subscribe if you're enjoying the content. I'll see you in the next video.